welcome back to the Effects of Trauma, Guiding Our Child Welfare Workers Part 2. Again, my name is Brittany Schank, and this is the second part of a 3-part webinar series. So the first part was all about the foundations of trauma, what trauma looks like, how trauma occurs, and then the last piece of it was why is it that when we have two kids in the same home enduring similar types of trauma, why do they look so differently? And so the second piece is going to be all about the brain, and then the third webinar will be all about where do we go from here. And so if you are interested in finding the first or the third one, just go ahead and type in YouTube this same title, The Effects of Trauma, Guiding Our Child Welfare Workers, and you'll be able to find Part 1 and Part 2. And so I just wanted to start by talking about who this webinar is for. When I did the research and compiled this webinar, I specifically made it for child welfare workers with the welfare workers in mind through the county. But with that said, this webinar could be super beneficial for childcare providers, foster parents, birth parents, therapists, anybody who works with children who have endured trauma. So I don't want the title to sway you away if you're not a child welfare worker, because I think that there's a lot of information that could be beneficial to a wide variety of people. So we will go ahead and get started. Like I said, for this webinar, we are going to be talking all about the brain. So we'll start with trauma and the brain, then we'll move on to the Bucharest Project, and then the last piece we'll talk about is resiliency. So beginning with infancy experiences, many people believe that traumatic experiences in infancy cannot be remembered later on in life. And so research tells us that that's false. Memories are formed throughout our entire lives, and all of our experiences change the brain, regardless if it's in infancy or if it's later on in life. And so I'm going to go ahead and just talk about a little bit about memories, and then how they form templates, and then how templates affect us for the rest of our lives. And so starting with memories, memories are formed throughout our entire lives, and so these can be anything. I mean, memories are good or bad. So memories can be things such as the first time you played baseball, or the calmness that you feel when you're hugging your mom or your dad or somebody close to you, or the first time you sang in a choir, or the first time you made a basketball hoop. So those are examples of good memories, and so obviously we know that there are bad memories too, and so those can be a lot of our traumatic experiences. So traumatic experience of being in a car crash, or some of the child abuse and neglect issues that we come into contact with. So memories could be being hit with objects when you were in trouble, or it could be sexual assaults or multiple sexual assaults. It could be when there is a fire in the home and your memory of you running out of the home. Memories are on a wide range of both good and bad, and medium memories. I mean, everything isn't just straight good or bad. So memories are all those things throughout our entire lives. And so every time a person receives incoming information, neural patterns of activity are created and compared against previously stored patterns. And so when new patterns are created, they create memories. And most of the stored memories templates are based upon early childhood experiences and when these first patterns were created and stored. Okay, so what that means is most of the time when we have memories, they've created a template, and so that template is something we revert back to. So on a good side, we could have a memory of us playing basketball over and over and over again when we were children. And so that memory might involve mom and dad outside playing basketball in the driveway. So then, as you had that memory over and over, it created a template. And so you associate playing basketball in the driveway with mom and dad as a happy experience. And so later on in life, you oftentimes seek out to do things like playing basketball because you have a template stored of playing basketball is a good memory. And so that also can be done on the reverse with bad memories. And so due to memories being stored and creating patterns, it can be absolutely detrimental to children who have experienced abuse or neglect. And so as an example, if a child relates their primary caregiver or another adult with fear, unpredictability, pain, or discomfort, it will affect them in their future. They might start relating people who are caregivers, people who are loving, as being unpredictable, as being fearful, as inducing pain. That's one example. Another example would be with sexual abuse. And so kids who are sexually abused and their neural pattern relates genital touch with fear at a young age will likely create problems with their psychosexual development later on in life. Sexual abuse affects the template of intimacy and touch in children and adults. And so children who have been sexually abused when they were young oftentimes will relate genital touch with being scared, with not knowing what to do, with being fearful. And so later on in life, when that template's formed, and they're in ages where they're sexually active, oftentimes the same fear will be elicited every time there's a sexual encounter. And so that clearly would have the potential to create some pretty big issues later on in life for our adults. And so when the question is raised, does trauma affect infants, or can they even remember? Yeah, absolutely. Trauma affects our infants, and that's actually one of the most detrimental time for trauma to occur, because they are creating those foundational patterns for the remainder of their life. And so as you can see on this slide, we have two videos that we're going to watch. The first video is on something called the still face experiment, and so this relates to infancy and neglect. And so I'm going to go ahead and pull that video up, and when we're done watching the video, we can talk about it a little bit.
Babies this young are extremely responsive to the emotions and the reactivity and the social interaction that they get from the world around them. This is something that we started studying 30, 40 years ago, when people didn't think that infants could engage in social interaction. In the still face experiment, what the mother did was she sits down and she's playing with her baby, who's about a year of age.
I'm like a girl. Oh.
And she gives a greeting to the baby gives a greeting back to her.
Yeah.
This baby starts pointing at different places in the world, and the mother's trying to engage her and play with her. They're working to coordinate their emotions and their intentions, what they want to do in the world. And that's really what the baby is used to. And then we ask the mother to not respond to the baby. The baby very quickly picks up on this. And then she uses all of her abilities to try and get the mother back. She smiles at the mother. She points because she's used to the mother looking where she points. The baby puts both hands up in front of her and says, "What's happening here?" She makes that screechy sound at the mother, like, "Come on, why aren't we doing this?" Even in this 2 minutes, when they don't get the normal reaction, they react with negative emotions, they turn away, they feel the stress of it. They actually may lose control of their posture because of the stress that they're experiencing.
Okay. I'm here. And what are you doing? Oh, yes. Oh, what a big girl.
It's a little like the good, the bad, and the ugly. The good is that normal stuff that goes on, that we all do with our kids. The bad is when something bad happens, but the infant can overcome it. After all, when you stop the still face, the mother and the baby start to play again. The ugly is when you don't give the child any chance to get back to the good. There's no reparation, and they're stuck in that really ugly situation.
So that video was called the Still Face Experiment, and I just got it right off of YouTube. And so some of my takeaways from that video were really the baby's need for reaction. And so when the mom was playing with the baby was very reactive, there was eye contact, the baby was laughing and giggling. And then when the mom had a still face, which I would correlate to our children who have endured neglect, where there's not a caregiver present, there's a lack of supervision, there's a lack of playing, the parent just is not in a parental role, they're not caring for that child. And so once we saw the mom disengage and just stare at the baby, the baby had an extreme desire and need for reaction and nurture and love. And so the baby started reacting in ways that would try to help cope. And so the baby starts screaming for mom to pay attention and starts kind of flailing around in her chair a little bit. And so these are a lot of our kids where we see in neglectful situations where any attention is better than no attention, so it might as well be some negative attention. And so there is an extreme need and desire in infancy for parents to be interactive and to be present. And so I just want to speak a little bit to the research in regards to cortisol. So cortisol is a chemical in the brain that spikes when stress occurs. And so it was initially assumed that children in foster care would likely experience high levels of cortisol. But it was actually found that children who experienced neglect had levels that were low in the morning and stayed that way throughout the day. And so research tells us that dysregulated cortisol levels increase the risk of anxiety, mood disorders, behavior problems, and post-traumatic stress disorder. And cortisol levels can be leveled out over time. And some of the ways that we do this are through the use of responsive caregivers and less stressful environments. And so it's really imperative that we help caregivers manage their stress and develop ways of positive interacting with children in order to bring these cortisol levels back to normal. And so that represents many of our kids in the foster care system and why it is so impactful when our kids are living in neglectful situations where there's not a caregiver who's responsive to them. And so this next video that we're going to watch is an older research experiment. It is with Harlow's monkeys, and so if you've seen it before, it's a fairly short video. And then we'll just watch it and talk about it in the end again. Sorry about that, I just had to do a little adjusting to my screen, so we will start with this video now.
Conquest. The search for new knowledge about our universe, our world, and ourselves. This monkey is an orphan, separated from his mother since the day of his birth. Literally, his life hangs by a thread. A soft cheesecloth pad that is his only companion, his only comfort. Once a day, the pad is removed for cleaning.
This is the laboratory of psychologist Harry Harlow.
Troubled, distressed, permanently deprived.
He is studying monkeys to better understand human relationships.
He may die for want of love.
Harlow believes he can use science to study love. With a series of pioneering experiments, he explores territory where few scientists have ventured.
Harlow said that there was such a thing as a science of love, for example, that love, the kind of intimacy that characterized relationships between mothers and infants, although in his case he studied monkeys, could be the object of science, that you literally could move love into a laboratory, put it under a microscope.
Harlow is studying love because he believes it makes an indelible impact on a young life. The relationship between a mother and her child, what Harlow calls our earliest social environment, could hold the key to explaining behavior throughout life. Harlow designs a set of ingenious experiments. He raises a baby monkey, allowing it to choose between two surrogate mothers, a wire mother that feeds it, and a cloth mother that doesn't. A cloth mother that Harlow thinks might provide something else: comfort and love.
Here's baby 106, weaned on a wire mother. He's going to the wire mother.
But this infant quickly runs to the cloth mother, where he will stay for the next 18 hours cuddling. In Harlow's mind, choosing nurturing over sustenance. In another experiment, Harlow creates a fearful situation. Whom does the infant turn to now?
Let's find out what his reactions to his mother are when we frighten him. He's scared, all right. And he does what any child will do in a similar situation. He was running to his mother, to touch her, to drive away his fear.
To Harlow, there is something about the experience of comfort and love, even more than food, that seems crucial to all these monkeys. But what happens when the infant is raised alone, without any mother at all, wire or cloth? In this situation, the orphan monkey stays alone. He won't even go to the cloth mother when frightened, but retreats into his own world. Harlow believes he has shown how want of love can damage an infant for life, and he worries the same is true for people.
What comes through loud and clear in Harry Harlow's experiment was that the early experience and the environment were crucial to the healthy development of the infant child, and that in a sense, if you messed up, if the right kind of maternal presence was not there during the critical years, then that infant might grow up to be an adult incapable of forming healthy relationships with other kinds of people.
Okay, so that was Harlow's experiment with monkeys. And so some of the things that I took out of that was that the monkeys chose nurturance over subsistence. And so really they spent 3/4 of their time with the monkey that was giving them love and affection as opposed to the monkey who was giving them food. And so that just goes to show how important love and affection and care is for our little ones, our infants, and the people in this world. And so the other part that was really interesting to me was the monkey who was by himself, and when they had the scary monkey come in, that he stayed by himself. He didn't go to the unknown monkey for comfort. And so that ties in really well with the end of it when the lady speaking had talked about if there's not the right environment with the right person in it, providing those nurturing capabilities, then it could lead to a child incapable of forming healthy relationships later on in life. And so it is imperative as child welfare workers that we are getting people who are able to love and care for these children in right away as soon as we can when kids come into our care, because it is extremely important when it comes to lifelong relationships and their ability to form those relationships. So I'm going to go ahead and move on to the Bucharest Project. This was a research study conducted in 2000 in a Romanian institution where there were 136 children from the ages of 6 months to 3 years, and they were being assessed in an impoverished institution. And so this research study that was conducted took half of the children from this institution were moved to foster families, and then the other half stayed in the Romanian institution. And then they had a control group that never lived in institutions. And so the study was conducted and showed that children who had been institutionalized, or neglected in this case, had severe cognitive delays, motor development delays, language delays, socio-emotional delays, and an increase in psychiatric disorders. And then additionally, EEGs on their brain showed changes in the electrical activity. And so the children in foster care, these children who were in the institution but then were moved into foster care, showed improvements in their IQ, language and social emotional functioning, and their attachments were much more significant with their caregivers. And lastly, they had a higher ability to express their emotions. And then when they looked at the kids that had never been institutionalized or neglected, in this case, they showed huge improvements from the institutionalized children. And they just showed overall to do much better than the children who had ever been institutionalized. And so, really, in this study, they looked concretely at children who had been removed by the age of 2, and they saw a significant increase in their IQ, their ability to show social emotional functioning if the children were removed by the age of 2. And so really what this study showed us is that being removed from a neglectful situation by the age of 2 leads to some extreme positive outcomes. This study also shows us that children who were never in a neglectful situation do not experience to the same level some of the deficits that children in a neglectful situation have experienced. And so I think this was really what shone brightly at me in this study was how important it is to intervene early on. And so I'm not saying that means pull kids into foster care early on if it's not warranted. Not at all, not by any means. But what I am saying is how important it is to intervene in neglectful situations as early as possible. So to teach parents those interactive skills with their children, to help parents be active parents instead of passive parents, to help parents get through whatever it is that's causing that barrier. So if that's chemical dependency or mental health or whatever that may be, a lack of parenting skills, whatever that may be, it really shows how important it is to get involved as soon as possible and early on, as this study showed us that if we intervene by the age of 2, our results are quite a bit higher than they would be if we intervened after that age. So early intervention is extremely important. And so the last thing I want to talk about is resilience. So to me, resilience is the ability for kids to bounce back. I mean, that's kind of the generic answer for what resilience is. But resilience to me has kind of become a term that we use to just say that, well, kids are resilient, so they'll be okay. Luckily, they're a kid and they're resilient. And so I think it's almost an excuse or something that makes us feel better, saying, well, they're resilient, they're kids, they'll bounce back. And so I just want to give a little bit of research with resiliency and then to tell a little bit of a story, and then we have one more slide and then we're done. But so there are several factors that contribute to childhood resiliency. So that is referring back to our ability to bounce back. And so some of the factors that contribute to this are the availability of caregivers that promote healthy psychological functioning, and also caregivers that promote being physically and emotionally available. And then also, lastly, the caregiver's ability to be sensitive to the child's emotional needs. And so caregivers are extremely encouraged to talk about the traumatic event at an age-appropriate level with the child. And so this does include allowing the child to ask questions and allow them to express their feelings. And so the child needs to be safe to feel safe for this to happen. A child is very likely not going to open up to somebody that they don't feel safe with. So we need to make sure that a child's feeling safe with their caregiver. But on top of that, a lot of times I hear caregivers ask, should I talk about mom, or do they remember what happened, or should we talk about what happened, or should I just leave it alone? It seems to cause them distress. It's important that a caregiver is able to be there emotionally for the child about the situation that occurred. So if the child starts bringing up, well, when I was at home, this scary thing happened, as the caregiver, do not stop that conversation. Do not get scared away from it or think, oh gosh, this is going to lead into a tantrum. If the child's ready to talk about it and they are talking about it, they look at you as a safe adult, and so they need to be able to talk about it. And that's a huge piece in looking at childhood resiliency and their ability to really overcome some of the obstacles that have gotten in the way of them moving through that trauma. So it's really important to be available as a caregiver and then to be able to listen openly and honestly to that child. And so research has told us over and over and over again that the number one aspect to resiliency is an available caregiver. And so if that's a foster parent, if that's a mom or a dad or a friend of the family or someone at church, whoever that is, that's the most important piece of childhood resiliency. And so the last story I really wanted to talk to you about from this slide was in regards to an adverse childhood experiences training, an ACE training I went to just within the last month or two. And a gentleman named Dave Ellis, founder of Dave Ellis Consulting, talked to us and presented this study to us. And he talked really well about resiliency. And so referring to the picture that's on this slide, this balloon that I'm guessing many of you have been looking at and thinking, I wonder how that is going to relate to what she's talking about. Dave Ellis brought up resiliency and talked about balloons. And he said the balloons are very similar to our kids. And so our kids endure trauma, and so their balloon fills up, and they work past that trauma, and their balloon gets deflated. And so balloons can be inflated and deflated over and over and over again, and they're fine. They're still functional. They still do what they need to do. But like a child, the balloon never goes back to its original state. It never looks exactly the same way it did before it was ever filled up with air or ever filled up with trauma. And so I think we have this false view about resiliency of the child started here, trauma occurred, and so now we just need to get them back to part A. We do need to get them back to where they started, but they will never ever look the same. All of our experiences, good and bad, change our person. And so to think that a child, just because they're a child, is really resilient and that trauma will never affect them is false. It's totally false. And it's just like this balloon on the screen of that the child likely will come through this trauma, and the child likely will learn how to function at a very high level again. But they're never, ever, ever going to look the same as they did in the beginning, and we need to embrace that, and we need to accept that. And so this next slide that we're looking at is a slide of the brain. And so on the left side, it's a healthy brain, and it shows that it's really red and yellow and radiant, and there's a lot of colors lit up. And so on it says, this PET scan of the brain of a normal child shows regions of high, which are the red, and low, blue and black activity. At birth, only primitive structures, such as brainstem, are fully functional. In regions like the temporal lobes, early childhood experiences wire the circuits. And then so you can look in the abused brain, and it shows that this is the brain of a Romanian orphan, which is the study we talked about, who was institutionalized shortly after birth. It shows the effects of extreme deprivation in infancy. The temporal lobes, which regulate emotions and receive input from the senses, are nearly gone. Such children suffer emotional and cognitive problems. And so this goes to show that neglect piece at early stages in life, it does affect the brain, and so it affects the brain pretty significantly. And so that's kind of the end of this webinar. I encourage you guys to email me any questions, comments, or suggestions. Let me know anything that you liked or disliked, or anything you would like any additional information on. Like I said, there will be a third part to this webinar series, and it's going to be where do we go from here, really aimed at child welfare workers, but many other people in the community will be able to gain some information from the third webinar as well. So again, I appreciate you guys listening. I look forward to hearing any questions or comments or suggestions that you guys have. Thanks so much. Take care.